Welcome to the first of the IChemE Safety Centre executive briefings. This topic will cover culture, risk and governance. My name is Trish Kerrin and I'm the Director of the IChemE Safety Centre. This presentation focuses on recent lessons from several inquiries and investigations into misconduct in the financial sector within Australia. It follows on from several other inquiries in other parts of the world. It provides some useful parallels when we consider process safety management. Let's start by talking about organisational culture. Contained here is a quote found in a report that investigated one of Australia's largest banking organisations. And it said, quote, "The working environment at the organisation is largely collegial, with high levels of trust in peers, teams and leaders." Now on the surface, that sounds very, very positive. But one of the challenges that occurred here was that trust was misplaced. It was actually said that it created an environment of chronic ease, where there was no challenge over what anybody else did. Areas of the organisation continued to do whatever they wanted to do within their structure, without any of the peers challenging what was actually going on. And that was partly related to the structure in this particular organisation. One of the challenges was they had what's known as a federated structure. Basically, this meant that there was an executive committee that was made up of the heads of all the different divisions of the organisation. The heads of those divisions all sat on this executive committee and reported through to the chief executive. And that committee was expected to actually run the entire financial institution. But because we had this environment of chronic ease, what actually was going on was that committee was not focused on running the entire organisation. Rather, each individual was focused on their division only. This resulted in a lot of gaps appearing in the organisation and different divisions getting away with things that perhaps they should not have been doing. The key here is the difference between espoused versus observed actions. The values of the organisation suggested they should be working together in a collegiate way while still challenging. However, the actions that were observed was that no challenge was ever given to anyone else. One of the other areas in the financial sector review was the area of remuneration and the challenge that this had. So basically, this is a challenge of performance was measured only by the outcome, not the process used to achieve it. And this then resulted in poor behaviour often being rewarded because the outcome was achieved, regardless of whether the process to achieve that outcome perhaps was even unlawful or certainly unconscionable. One of the challenges that we see here is this is Goodhart striking again. If you remember the cartoon on the front page of this slide pack, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Now that's not to say that we can't have targets and measures in our organisations. We need to have them. But we need to be very careful about what unintended behaviours those targets are actually driving. So thinking about it from the perspective of if your target is encouraging a certain type of behaviour, what other target or process do you have in place to ensure that the behaviour is always as it should be? Within the financial sector, some of the things we saw occurring were items such as bank tellers actually depositing money into accounts that weren't their own, simply to keep that account active because they had a performance metric on the number of active accounts they maintained. Now this very clearly seems to be an inappropriate behaviour, but it was rewarded. They received bonuses for keeping accounts active, even though the accounts were not truly active. A parallel to consider in safety here is how are we rewarding incident or injury results? Are we rewarding employees in our organisations for not having incidents or injuries occur? Is this actually inhibiting reporting, or are we still seeing the true reflection of the incidents that take place? When it came to the management of non-financial risk, the financial sector was found to be lacking in that space. They were managing their financial risk, but they weren't actually dealing with their non-financial or operational risk, as we would call it in process safety. They employed the 3 lines of defence model. The first line is the people that sit within the business and report to the business. They're there to provide assistance and guidance at the ground level. The second level is the independent corporate type function. They should be free to set the agenda, to set the standards that the rest of the organisation should be working to. And the third line of defence is the independent audit function. Now, in the example earlier where we talked about the chronic ease within an organisation, one of the challenges they had was that the independent function was actually not working as an independent function. They were actually reporting through to heads of division that sat on the executive committee. Therefore, they were at the whim of the leader of that part of the business. They were therefore unable to raise issues above their own organisation to get to the corporate level, or indeed the board, when items needed to be reviewed or challenged. This created an organisation where the independent function was just not working at all. There was actually a group risk officer also sitting within that executive committee, although they weren't really seen as effective as a peer, and therefore they didn't really have any influence over the way the bank was being run. If we look at how they were managing risk, we look at the difference between compliance risk and conduct risk. So compliance risk is the risk of not complying with a legal requirement. Conduct risk is the risk of people doing the wrong thing to get an outcome. Now, we saw that in the remuneration area where the outcome was rewarded, not the process to get there. And this actually led to a situation of conduct risk. This can be better summed up by the concept of when you're looking at whether something is possible or whether a decision should be taken, the question should not be, can we do it? The question should more be, should we do it? Could actually be something that's technically legal, but it might not be ethical or moral. And this then creates a challenge, especially when needing to look after an organisation's reputation publicly, if they're seen to be doing things that are not accepted within the community they serve. If we now look at governance, one of the challenges that we saw in governance was that there was no clear accountability for who was responsible for managing both compliance and conduct risk. That then led to a situation of no challenge at all. Everybody just accepted what everybody else said, rather than challenging whether it was the right thing or whether it needed to be improved. This was seen all the way up to the boards of organisations, not just at the executive level. Boards were seen to be accepting what was going on and what management were telling them, rather than actually asking deep questions to challenge the information they're receiving. This then led to a situation where the monitoring and measuring of the organisational performance was lacking as well, resulting in the board not actually providing effective oversight into the conduct of the organisation. Now, one of the challenges we have in this is, how do we deal with information and reporting? What should be sent up to the board? The answer is not more information. The answer is actually the right information, quality information, or what we like to call metrics with insight. It's not just merely numbers, and it's not hundreds of pages of reports. Making sure the board is informed is not a factor of just providing them with reams and reams of paper. It's actually about making sure they have the right information, but the board itself then needs to make sure it asks the right questions. It needs to be deeply penetrating in the questions it asks of the organisation, and it should be familiar with the organisation's overall function and operations. So what does this actually mean for process safety? I've spoken a lot about banking and the finance sector here. If we cast our minds back to the Baker report that came out after the Texas City refinery incident that occurred in 2005, there were 10 specific recommendations that were made. 7 of them have very clear parallels to what I've been speaking about. Now, all of these areas have actually come out so far in this presentation. The leadership and the culture of the organisation are vital to ensure that conduct risk is actually managed and we're not left at the mercy of Goodhart. Expectations and accountabilities are vital so that everybody understands who is responsible and accountable for what part of the business and who is able to effectively challenge in that instance as well. Support for line management is vital to make sure that people have the resources that they need to fulfill their role, and also make sure that the conduct that is being undertaken actually does meet all of the requirements. Leading and lagging metrics are very important to make sure that the board can track and understand the performance of the organisation. But remember, this is metrics with insight that's important. Auditing is vital to make sure that the organisation assesses how it's performing. Those audit reports then need to be cascaded up through the organisation, ensuring that any issues that are found are highlighted to the board. Now, these are obviously material issues that need to be highlighted to the board, but the board also need the ability to challenge back and query if they're not receiving audit information, or if it's overly positive that they need to understand what's actually going on to ensure that what they're seeing is actually an accurate reflection of the organisation. Lastly, the board have an obligation and a duty to monitor the performance of the organisation, to monitor the conduct within the organisation, and ultimately the leadership of the organisation starts with the board, and the culture of the organisation is driven by the board. The behaviour that the board displays itself reflects what it will expect from the chief executive, and that then cascades throughout the entire organisation. So it is vitally important that the board display appropriate leadership and culture across all of the organisation that they work with. In conclusion, it's useful to focus also on the due diligence model that we've seen appear in some legislative environments around the world now for safety. Due diligence can best be summarised by these 6 headings: know, understand, resource, monitor, comply, and verify. So this actually requires officers of a corporation to have knowledge of health and safety matters, to understand the operations that are being conducted and the risks associated with those operations, to ensure that people operating the organisation have and use appropriate resources to eliminate or minimise the risks to health and safety, to ensure that the business has appropriate processes in place to receive and respond in a timely manner to any incidents or information provided, to ensure that the organisation complies with all legal duties, and finally to have a process in place to verify that these 5 things have actually been done. This is a very useful framework for thinking about how to manage and lead an organisation. For further information, you can download the ISC Executive Briefing Paper number 1, Culture, Risk and Governance, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, the Prudential Inquiry into the Commonwealth Bank of Australia 2018, or the Australian Institute of Company Directors produced a very good summary of the Royal Commission that is also available from their website. If you're interested in understanding more about due diligence, there's a book by Michael Toomer called Duty of Officers. This is a really useful explanation of the due diligence model and how it can be effectively applied. If you'd like any more information on process safety, leadership and culture programs available from the ICME Safety Centre, please contact us at safetycentre@icme.org.